The tense silence inside the main conference hall of Apex Capital. Logistics pressed against my eardrums like heavy water as Vice President Madeline Thorne slammed her open palm down onto the polished glass table. All 80 employees sat completely motionless beneath the harsh glare of the overhead fluorescent lighting. Even the habitual keyboard tappers and pen clickers had frozen in place. Every single breath in the crowded room felt loud and exposed. "Stand up right now and apologize to my daughter for your gross incompetence, or clean out your desk before lunch," Madeline announced, her authoritative voice bouncing off the high acoustic walls of our corporate headquarters. Her daughter, Chloe Thorne, who had been brought into the firm 6 months ago as a junior staffer and mysteriously elevated to senior risk manager just last week, sat beside the executive leadership team. A faint, smug smirk curled at the corners of Chloe's lips. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as 80 pairs of eyes turned toward where I sat at the rear of the room. I was 49 years old. I had spent 15 long years building my professional reputation at Apex Capital Logistics as a meticulous financial analyst and risk auditor. I had arrived early, worked late, and built every major forecasting model our executives relied upon during board negotiations. But to Madeline Thorne, 15 years of dedication meant nothing compared to shielding her daughter from the consequences of her own failure. I slowly rose from my ergonomic chair, the metal legs scraping harshly against the hardwood floor, in the dead quiet of the auditorium. The walk from the back row to the front podium felt interminable, each heavy step echoing through the silent room like a ticking countdown clock on my entire career. Madeline's triumph was plain on her face. Her smile widened, anticipating the exact moment of my public humiliation. She believed she had trapped me completely. She assumed that a 49-year-old corporate employee with a mortgage and a daughter in college would choose silent submission over immediate termination. She had never truly understood who I was. Instead of walking behind the speaker's lectern to offer an apology, I stepped directly over to the media workstation, controlling the auditorium display system. I plugged my personal encrypted tablet into the main digital interface. The overhead laser projector hummed quietly as the giant wall screen flashed to life. "I believe the internal record will clarify the exact situation for everyone present," I said softly, my voice calm, even, and steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. Madeline's smug expression evaporated the instant I failed to offer the expected apology. Her eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. Before she could move or speak, I tapped the digital screen. The clear, uncompressed audio of Chloe's voice erupted from the high-definition ceiling speakers, echoing throughout the hall. "Mom, I totally botched the quarterly Harrington merger presentation." Chloe's recorded voice whimpered over the speakers. "I mixed up their financial liability assessment with our internal growth projections. But do not worry, I told the board members it was all Howard's fault. I said he gave me corrupt data files." Then came Madeline's unmistakable, crisp voice over the audio system. "Perfect, darling. Keep blaming Howard Vance for every discrepancy. Once this multi-million-dollar acquisition closes next month, we will restructure the analytics department anyway. Just hold tight until our performance bonuses clear escrow." A wave of shocked gasps rippled through the audience of 80 employees. Several department supervisors leaned back in their chairs, their mouths open in disbelief. Madeline bolted up from her leather seat, her designer heels clicking sharply against the floor as she rushed toward the media console. "That is private internal communication," Madeline shouted, her voice shrill and trembling with sudden fury. "Disconnect that device immediately." CEO Walter Briggs, who sat at the head of the executive table, raised a single firm hand into the air. "Continue playing the file, Howard," Walter commanded, his stern voice dropping several octaves as his face hardened into stone. I nodded once toward the chief executive officer and tapped the display screen again to trigger the second chronological audio recording. "Just delete his original risk assessment slides." Before the board meeting tomorrow morning, Madeline's recorded voice instructed her daughter in crisp detail. "Tell the directors there was a technical corruption in the shared drive. We need the board to evaluate only your version of the acquisition proposal. But what if one of the senior investors asks specific questions about debt obligations that I cannot answer?" Chloe's recorded voice whined in response. Then you look directly at Howard Vance and ask why his baseline numbers failed to support your optimistic conclusions. Madeline answered without a second of hesitation. Make him look unprepared and incompetent. With every new sentence that echoed through the room, the color drained further from Madeline Thorne's face. Chloe shrank down in her leather executive chair, no longer smirking, staring helplessly at her own trembling hands as 80 colleagues witnessed her exposure. CO Walter Briggs stood up slowly from his seat, turning his sharp gaze toward me. How long has this systematic misrepresentation been occurring inside our organization? I met the chief executive officer's eyes directly. Since Chloe Thorne was hired 6 months ago, I replied clearly. I possess time-stamped, digitally signed copies of all my original risk assessments alongside the altered versions submitted under Chloe's name. Furthermore, this is not an isolated incident confined to my department. I have documented statements from 3 former analysts who were forced out under identical pressure over the past 2 years. The conference hall remained in complete silence as I unplugged my tablet device and returned to my seat in the back row. Madeline stood motionless near the front podium, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish out of water. But as I sat down, I knew this public confrontation was only the opening skirmish. A much larger legal and corporate battle was about to begin. To understand how I found myself standing in front of 80 colleagues exposing my direct supervisor, one must understand how Apex Capital Logistics operated before Madeline Thorne arrived. For nearly 15 years, I had built a quiet, respectable career as a senior quantitative analyst. My work was grounded in cold, hard facts, precision modeling, and unyielding professional integrity. When major clients evaluated acquisition terms or corporate restructurings, they requested my risk assessments because they knew I never inflated projections or buried liabilities. Everything changed 6 months ago when Madeline Thorne was appointed Vice President of Corporate Strategy. Madeline was an aggressive executive who measured success not by operational efficiency or actual earnings, but by personal optics, political alliances, and rapid executive expansion. 3 days after her arrival, she brought her 24-year-old daughter, Chloe, into the firm as a junior associate during a department-wide orientation meeting. Madeline had stood beside her daughter with an uncomfortable degree of pride. Howard Vance will be mentoring Chloe. Directly, Madeline announced to the room, casting a pointed look in my direction. Show her everything you know about our analytical framework. I noticed several seasoned colleagues exchange subtle, knowing glances around the conference table. Everyone in the building understood what mentoring the vice president's daughter truly implied. Performing her assigned tasks, correcting her mistakes, and taking the blame if anything went wrong, all while maintaining my own heavy workload. That very afternoon, Chloe sat down beside my desk in the analytics bullpen. She spent the first 40 minutes scrolling idly through her personal social media feeds while I walked her through our proprietary financial modeling software. This is impossibly tedious, Chloe sighed heavily, after less than 15 minutes of explanation. Can you not just give me a simplified summary sheet so I can hand it to my mother? Understanding the underlying quantitative methodology is essential for risk evaluation, I explained patiently. Otherwise, if an investor asks about liquidity ratios or debt covenants during a negotiation, you will not be able to defend your conclusions. Otherwise what? Chloe replied, curling her lip with casual contempt. My mother runs this entire division, Howard. I do not need to understand every little mathematical detail when the outcomes are already decided at the top level. I should have recognized that moment as a severe warning sign, but I still believed in professional meritocracy and basic workplace decency. I assumed that even executive nepotism had natural boundaries dictated by corporate compliance and legal accountability. I was entirely mistaken. The first assignment I delegated to Chloe was straightforward: compile customer retention data and historical revenue streams for our quarterly operational review. I provided her with standardized data templates, explicit written instructions, and direct access to our secure database queries. 3 days later, during the executive review session, Chloe presented a completely altered analysis that bore no resemblance to the dataset I had provided. Her figures omitted critical operational expenses, exaggerated quarterly growth rates by over 30%, and painted a dangerously inaccurate picture of corporate stability. When CEO Walter Briggs paused the presentation to question the obvious mathematical discrepancies, Chloe turned her eyes toward me with an expression of practiced innocence. "Howard told me to structure the analysis this way," Chloe announced softly to the room. "I was simply following his explicit instructions." I felt the entire executive team turn their attention to my side of the table. "That statement is completely inaccurate," I stated calmly. The written guidelines and raw data sets I provided to Chloe contained zero reference to those inflated figures. "Are you calling my daughter a liar in front of the executive committee?" Madeline interrupted instantly, her voice dropping into a razor-thin tone that carried a clear threat of retaliation. I spent the remainder of that meeting attempting to salvage the analytical presentation while simultaneously protecting my professional reputation. Immediately after the board members departed, Madeline summoned me into her corner office overlooking the city skyline. "If you are incapable of working harmoniously with Chloe, perhaps we need to reevaluate your long-term position with Apex Capital Logistics," Madeline warned, tapping her manicured nails against her mahogany desk. "Chloe is young and adapting to executive leadership. You are supposedly an experienced senior analyst. Any organizational friction reflects far more poorly on your leadership than on hers." That meeting marked the official beginning of a systematic campaign to undermine my standing. Over the next 5 months, Chloe routinely took credit for my successful forecasting models while assigning her mathematical errors to my oversight. Comprehensive reports I authored were intercepted and modified prior to board distribution. Key digital communication threads were selectively deleted from shared folders. My annual performance rating was downgraded for the first time in 15 years. The breaking point occurred during preparations for the Harrington acquisition, a deal valued at $45 million that represented the largest corporate expansion in our firm's history. I spent 4 exhausting weeks examining Harrington's balance sheets, discovering hidden environmental liabilities and unrecorded pension obligations that threatened our long-term liquidity. The evening before our preliminary presentation to the board, I stayed late in the office to finalize my warning report. The building was nearly empty when I heard quiet voices coming from the executive break room down the hall. "Mom, I am genuinely worried about tomorrow's presentation." Chloe's voice echoed softly through the doorway. "Howard's analysis is incredibly detailed, and he uncovered major financial liabilities in Harrington's structure. What if the board members ask me technical questions about those debt figures?" I froze in the shadow of the hallway, keeping out of sight. "Do not worry about Howard's report, darling," Madeline replied smoothly. "I have already discussed his work with Walter Briggs, framing his findings as overly alarmist and outdated. We will present your optimistic valuation model tonight, and by next month, when the merger closes, you will be promoted to department director while Howard is quietly severed from the company." I backed away silently down the carpeted hallway, my pulse racing. The picture was suddenly crystal clear. This was not simple incompetence or executive favoritism. It was deliberate, calculated corporate fraud designed to enrich Madeline and Chloe while using me as a disposable scapegoat. That night, sitting in my home study at 49 years old, I made a solemn decision. I would not allow 15 years of honest work to be destroyed. I initiated a comprehensive documentation protocol. Every file, every modified report, every email chain, and every verbal instruction was cataloged with digital cryptographic timestamps. Under applicable state wiretap statutes, operating under single-party consent rules, I began recording every professional interaction involving Madeline and Chloe Thorne. I was not seeking petty workplace revenge. I was preparing for legal survival. During the 2 weeks following my discovery in the hallway, I operated with meticulous precision. By day, I maintained my standard routine as a quiet, compliant senior analyst, attending meetings and taking notes while Madeline and Chloe continued to alter my work products. By night, I organized evidence into a bulletproof legal repository. I recovered original data files from redundant server backups with the assistance of an internal ally. I compiled side-by-side comparative spreadsheets demonstrating that over 40 distinct financial metrics had been manually inflated by Chloe Thorne prior to executive distribution. I cross-referenced these altered figures with federal corporate reporting standards under Sarbanes-Oxley provisions, specifically 18 United States Code, Section 1514A, which protects whistleblowers who report internal financial manipulation affecting corporate shareholders. However, I knew that presenting this evidence to internal human resources would be entirely futile. HR reported directly to Madeline Thorne's executive network, and CEO Walter Briggs had consistently turned a blind eye to her aggressive management tactics as long as quarterly earnings appeared strong. I needed external leverage that the executive team could neither ignore nor suppress. At 6 o'clock on a rainy Tuesday morning, I sat in a secluded corner booth of a quiet diner located 3 blocks from our corporate headquarters. 20 minutes later, Evelyn Drake walked through the door. Evelyn Drake was 71 years old and held a 15% founding stake in Apex Capital Logistics. She rarely visited the corporate office, preferring to monitor her investments from afar. But she was widely respected for her fierce integrity and sharp financial intellect. I had worked directly with Evelyn 8 years prior, during a complex audit, and she had always valued my uncompromising accuracy. Howard, Evelyn said as she slipped into the booth across from me, her sharp blue eyes assessing my tired face. Your message sounded urgent. What is happening inside Apex Capital? I opened my leather briefcase, pulled out a bound dossier of side-by-side report comparisons, and placed a secure audio playback device on the table between us. For the next 30 minutes, I walked Evelyn through the mountain of evidence I had gathered. I played the recordings of Madeline instructing Chloe to alter data, displayed the time-stamped server logs, and demonstrated how the presented Harrington acquisition figures hid over $12 million in unrecorded liabilities. Evelyn listened in complete, stony silence. She examined the comparative balance sheets, her brow furrowing as she verified the mathematical manipulation. When the final recording finished playing, she closed the dossier firmly. This is not merely gross nepotism or poor management, Howard, Evelyn said, her voice dripping with ice. This is premeditated securities fraud that exposes every shareholder in this company to catastrophic legal liability. Why bring this to me instead of taking it directly to Walter Briggs or Human Resources? Because Human Resources is compromised by Madeline's influence, and Walter has repeatedly dismissed warnings about her department, I answered truthfully. You are the senior founding shareholder with enough personal authority to force an immediate executive intervention before this fraudulent merger closes. Evelyn tapped her golden pen against the table, reflecting deeply. The annual all-staff meeting and executive board review takes place on Thursday morning, she noted. Madeline intends to use that meeting to publicly discipline you and solidify Chloe's position. That is correct, I replied. She gave me an ultimatum, apologize to her daughter in front of 80 employees, or be terminated on the spot. Evelyn's lips curved into a cold, ruthless smile. Then you will attend that meeting exactly as planned, Howard. Accept her public challenge, walk to that podium, and display every single recording and document on the main screen. I will arrange for regulatory observers and corporate legal counsel to monitor the proceedings. Let Madeline Thorne construct her own trap. I returned to the office that morning with a renewed sense of purpose, though my nerves were stretched to the breaking point. On Wednesday afternoon, less than 18 hours before the scheduled all-staff assembly, my desk phone rang. Howard Vance, CEO Walter Briggs' voice came through the receiver, sounding clipped and unusually tense. Step into my corner office immediately. When I entered the executive suite, Walter Briggs was not alone. Sitting alongside him were Nadia Miller, the firm's chief legal counsel, and Julian Cross, a senior member of the corporate board of directors. The atmosphere inside the glass-walled room was thick with unspoken tension. Close the door and sit down, Howard, Walter instructed, gesturing to a leather chair across from his mahogany desk. I sat down, Keeping my posture straight and my expression neutral, we received a preliminary communication from Evelyn Drake earlier today. Legal counsel Nadia Miller began, leaning forward with a serious expression. She alerted us to severe allegations regarding altered financial disclosures in the Harrington acquisition file. Madeline Thorne has served this corporation for over a decade and generated substantial reported revenue, board member Julian Cross added, crossing his arms. We cannot act on unverified claims that could disrupt our market valuation. I looked Julian Cross directly in the eyes. The claims are fully verified with digital timestamps, cryptographic server logs, and audio recordings of Madeline explicitly directing the falsification of financial reports, I stated calmly. Nadia Miller exchanged a long look with Walter Briggs. If these documents demonstrate deliberate alteration of board disclosures, our legal exposure under federal regulations is immense, Nadia admitted quietly. However, executing an immediate executive suspension without public clarity could spark panic among our primary investors. Which brings us to tomorrow morning's staff meeting, Walter Briggs said, his tone calculating. Madeline believes she is going to force your resignation in front of the entire company. We want to observe her actions in real time while our legal team evaluates the evidentiary trail. You will attend the meeting, Howard. When she makes her demand, you will present your findings. As I walked out of the executive suite, I realized the bitter reality of my position. Walter Briggs and the board were not acting out of moral righteousness or concern for my career. They were using me as operational bait to trap Madeline Thorne and insulate themselves from shareholder lawsuits. I was walking directly into a corporate minefield, but it was a battle I was fully prepared to fight. The main auditorium was already packed to capacity when I entered on Thursday morning. 80 employees, ranging from junior analysts to department directors, filled the rows of seats. The ambient noise of nervous chatter hummed through the air, as rumors had circulated for days that a senior SEAL employee was about to be publicly terminated. Chloe Thorne sat proudly alongside the executive committee at the front table, wearing a tailored designer suit and exuding an aura of untouchable authority. Madeline Thorne stood at the central lectern, adjusting her microphone and scanning the crowd until her eyes locked onto mine at the rear of the hall. CEO Walter Briggs opened the proceedings with brief, standardized remarks concerning quarterly operational metrics. Then, with a subtle glance in my direction, he yielded the podium to Madeline. "Thank you, Walter," Madeline began, her voice projecting clearly through the hall speakers. "Before we review our strategic expansion goals, there is an urgent internal matter regarding professional accountability that must be addressed publicly." A tense hush fell over the audience of 80 employees. Over the past 6 months, our corporate analytics team has experienced recurring errors and delayed reporting, Madeline continued, her tone laden with theatrical disappointment. Most recently, flawed financial models prepared by senior analyst Howard Vance nearly compromised our $45 million acquisition of the Harrington Group. Fortunately, senior risk manager Chloe Thorne identified these critical oversights and provided corrected projections. Madeline paused, her eyes narrowing as she pointed directly at where I sat. At Apex Capital Logistics, we hold integrity and accountability above all else, Madeline declared loudly. Refusing to acknowledge one's professional failures is unacceptable. Howard Vance, stand up right now and apologize to my daughter for your gross incompetence. Or clean out your desk before lunch. That was the moment the trap sprung. I stood up slowly, walked down the center aisle, and connected my tablet to the media console, playing the recorded audio files that laid bare the entire conspiracy. The immediate aftermath inside the hall was total chaos. As the final recording of Madeline instructing Chloe to frame me faded from the speakers, Madeline stood paralyzed at the podium, her face completely drained of color. "You will never work in this industry again, Howard," Madeline shrieked, her composed persona shattering into raw panic. "I will sue you for illegal wiretapping and defamation." "Do you have any idea who my legal contacts are?" "That will be enough, Madeline," a commanding voice declared from the back entrance, every head turned as senior investor. Evelyn Drake walked down the central aisle, flanked by two federal regulatory inspectors from the Securities and Exchange Commission and Chief Legal Counsel Nadia Miller. This assembly was intended as an internal review. Madeline stammered, backing away from the lectern. "I invited these regulatory inspectors personally," Evelyn Drake replied coldly, stepping to the front of the room. After reviewing the verified digital audit trails yesterday, it became clear that federal reporting standards have been violated. At that moment, junior analyst Toby Finch stood up from the third row of the audience. Toby had worked quietly in our bullpen for 2 years, often enduring harsh criticism from Chloe. "What Howard presented is completely true," Toby announced loudly, his voice shaking slightly but holding firm. 2 months ago, Madeline Thorne ordered me to recalculate the Harrington debt ratios to show a 40% profit margin. When I told her the data did not support that figure, she removed me from the project and threatened to terminate my contract. One by one, 4 other department staff members stood up, offering immediate testimonies of altered records, coerced signatures, and systematic intimidation. The room erupted into furious murmuring as the full scale of Madeline's corruption was exposed. The federal regulatory inspectors moved swiftly to the executive table, presenting formal documentation to seize relevant server logs and email archives. Madeline Thorne and Chloe Thorne were escorted from the auditorium by corporate security guards to collect their personal belongings under strict supervision. As 80 employees filed out of the hall in a state of shock, CEO Walter Briggs approached me near the media console. "Your actions took extraordinary courage, Howard," Walter said quietly, though his eyes reflected deep unease. My office in 30 minutes to discuss departmental leadership. Before I could reach Walter's office, my personal phone vibrated in my pocket. I looked at the screen and saw an encrypted text message from an unknown number. "Parking garage. Level 3. Come alone right now if you want to see the full picture." I took the service elevator down to level 3 of the underground parking structure. The concrete garage was vast, cold, and largely deserted. Leaning against a support column near the far wall was Clara Foley, our head of IT infrastructure and digital security. "You sent the text, Clara?" I asked, keeping my distance as my footsteps echoed off the concrete. Clara nodded grimly, pulling an encrypted tablet from her coat. "We only have 5 minutes before the executive floor goes into complete lockdown," Clara warned. "What you exposed in the hall today is only the tip of the iceberg, Howard." She handed me the tablet display. On the screen was a directory of restricted system logs spanning the past 12 months. 3 months ago, Madeline requested unauthorized administrative access to secure executive communications, Clara explained. "She was not just sabotaging your risk assessments, Howard. She was actively compiling blackmail dossiers on CEO Walter Briggs, board member Julian Cross, and several key investors." I stared at the screen in disbelief. The folders contained private financial records, undisclosed personal conflicts of interest, and off-the-books transactions involving top company officials. "Blackmail?" I whispered. "Precisely," Clara confirmed. Walter Briggs knew Madeline was manipulating internal reports months ago, but he was terrified to confront her because she held proof of his personal financial liabilities. That is why he allowed her to run rampant. "Madeline has contingency plans, Howard. She is preparing to release these encrypted dossiers to the press to burn the entire company down before she goes to prison." I looked at the tablet screen, realizing the terrifying depth of the corporate web. Exposing Madeline's public demand for an apology was only the first layer. The entire executive foundation of Apex Capital Logistics was rotting from within, and I was now standing directly in the center of the storm. An hour after my meeting with Clara Foley in the parking structure, I sat in the executive boardroom, alongside senior investor Evelyn Drake, chief legal counsel Nadia Miller, board member Julian Cross, and CEO Walter Briggs. The mood inside the room was heavy, tense, and suffocating. "We are facing an existential corporate crisis," Nadia Miller stated, laying out legal documentation across the table. "Federal regulators have initiated a formal inquiry under Sarbanes-Oxley guidelines. If news of these altered Harrington disclosures reaches the financial press before we restructure our leadership, our stock value will collapse overnight. We must contain this scandal immediately," Julian Cross urged, turning his gaze toward me. Howard, we are prepared to offer you an immediate promotion to Vice President of Risk Management and Compliance with a substantial salary increase, provided you sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding internal executive communications. I looked around the table at the powerful figures sitting before me. They were still attempting to manage optics, protect their personal positions, and sweep the deeper corruption under the rug. I will not sign any non-disclosure agreement that conceals systemic fraud, I stated firmly, my voice echoing off the glass walls. And I know about the administrative security dossiers compiled over the past year. Walter Briggs flinched noticeably, his face turning pale as he gripped the edge of the conference table. If this organization wishes to survive federal scrutiny, I continued, we must turn over every single server log, every altered report, and every executive communication file to the regulatory inspectors today. Complete, uncompromised transparency is our only legal path forward. Evelyn Drake nodded her approval slowly. Howard is entirely correct, Evelyn declared firmly. The era of secret deals and executive cover-ups at Apex Capital is over. Suddenly, my mobile phone vibrated on the table. It was a text message from Madeline Thorne. Meet me at the coffee shop across the street in 10 minutes. If you refuse, I release the complete executive files to the national media immediately. I showed the message to Evelyn Drake and Nadia Miller. I will meet her, I said, but I am bringing full digital recording hardware. 10 minutes later, I walked into the quiet cafe across from our headquarters. Madeline Thorne sat alone in a corner booth, wearing dark sunglasses and a simple coat, stripped of her executive swagger. You have caused a tremendous amount of damage, Howard, Madeline said coldly as I sat down across from her. You brought this upon yourself the moment you attempted to destroy my career to cover your daughter's fraud, I replied calmly. Madeline leaned forward, her voice dropping into a desperate whisper. I am offering you a deal, Howard. I possess encrypted evidence proving that Walter Briggs and Julian Cross approved altered financial statements long before I arrived. If you issue a public statement claiming that Chloe was merely following flawed department procedures, I will provide you with the master key to those executive dossiers. You can clean out the entire corrupt board and rule this company yourself. It was a powerful, dangerous offer. She was handing me the ultimate corporate weapon. But I realized that accepting her deal would make me no different from Madeline herself, using secrets, blackmail, and manipulation to seize authority. I do not want to rule a corrupt company through blackmail. Madeline, I answered clearly, looking her directly in the eyes. I want an organization built on truth, compliance, and legal integrity. The complete files have already been handed over to federal inspectors by IT security. Madeline's eyes widened in sheer horror as she realized her final leverage had vanished. She slumped back in the booth, defeated and powerless. I stood up, left the diner, and returned directly to the corporate headquarters. Over the next 48 hours, the truth washed through Apex Capital Logistics like a cleansing flood. CEO Walter Briggs submitted his formal resignation under mounting board pressure. Board member Julian Cross was removed from his position following disclosures of financial conflicts of interest. Madeline Thorne and Chloe Thorne were formally indicted by federal prosecutors for corporate securities, fraud, and falsification of financial records. Senior investor Evelyn Drake assumed the role of interim executive chairwoman of the board. Her very first official action was appointing me as the permanent vice president of risk management and compliance, giving me full authority to restructure our analytical frameworks and implement unyielding compliance protocols. 3 months have passed since that explosive all-staff meeting in the main auditorium. Today, I sit in my new executive office, the office that once belonged to Walter Briggs. The mahogany furniture is gone, replaced by clean modern workstations equipped with transparent data interfaces. The Harrington acquisition was successfully renegotiated, based on my original, honest risk assessments, securing a fair deal that protected our shareholders without hiding liabilities. Toby Finch was promoted to senior analyst, leading a team of dedicated professionals who know they will never be asked to falsify a single number. Clara Foley was appointed Chief Information Security Officer, overseeing an immutable, blockchain-verified digital logging system that prevents any unauthorized alteration of corporate documents. Every morning, when I walk through the main hall of Apex Capital Logistics, I see the 80 employees working with confidence, knowing that merit, accuracy, and truth are protected within these walls. My 15-year struggle was not merely about saving my own job or exposing a toxic supervisor. It was about proving that integrity can overcome corporate corruption when someone has the courage to stand up, present the facts, and let the truth speak for itself.